These days, this phenomenon of open source models slowly approaching closed source models with much less training cost and being a lot smaller and obviously editable is getting even better. So one of the most interesting new models that I want to put on your radar is welcome back to NeuroBridge. I'm Tarush and I'm the host of this podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the top three trends in AI over the past 3 or so months. And these are trends that you might not have heard just yet, but they're trends that you need to put on your radar right now. So, trend number one is open source AI models are slowly approaching closed source AI models on performance and efficacy for users. So, let's first differentiate between an open source and a closed source model. A closed source model is basically a model which the weights are privatized, which literally means you can't play around with it or change the numbers for a specific task. An open source model is the exact opposite of that. You can change the weights and change it to do a specific thing. Historically, closed source models, famous examples of which are, the top ChatGPT models such as GPT-5, Anthropic 4.5 Sonnet. These are all closed source, meaning the model companies don't want you to access the weights because that's their intellectual property. And of course, it's every right of theirs to keep that private. So historically, those closed source models have far outperformed open source models. Interestingly enough, this is because historically, if you were able to put billions of dollars into training these models, you would have a better result than everybody else. Of course, this was until things like DeepSeek happened. And I actually have another video covering that on my channel. So if you're interested, you should go take a look. However, these days, this phenomenon of open source models slowly approaching closed source models with much less training cost and being a lot smaller and obviously editable is getting even better. So one of the most interesting new models that I want to put on your radar is Kimi K2 Thinking. So Kimi K2 Thinking is a model which is backed by Alibaba. It was trained on only $4.6 million. I'm so used to saying billion on this channel, but it's actually only $4.6 million, which is a very minuscule amount of money that you can use to train an AI model. Additionally, it only has 32 billion active parameters, which basically means if I'm talking to the model, it'll only use 32 billion parameters to give me a response. It actually has a trillion total parameters, but that's besides the point. Essentially, that's pretty small compared to the top closed source models like GPT-5, which I mean obviously we don't have the exact numbers, but that is a predicted 200 to 400 billion active parameters. So that's almost more than 10x Kimi K2's. So let's just quickly summarize. An open source model like Kimi K2 Thinking spent only $4.6 million on training, is a like quite literally a tenth of the size of active parameters as compared to the top models, and it's completely open source, whereas the other models are proprietary and kept private. So given that in comparison with stuff like OpenAI being spending billions of dollars on their training, having much bigger models and being closed source, who do you think would perform better on benchmarks? Your answer is probably OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind. It's not. Actually, that's not the case, funnily enough. Kimi K2 outperforms OpenAI GPT-5 High. It outperforms Claude Sonnet 4.5 Thinking. It also outperforms Grok 4 on HLE, Humanity's Last Exam, which is one of the most famous benchmarks out there. So the fact that it can do that is crazy. I mean, it still underperforms on other stuff like coding, but even on agentic, it does really well, as you can see on the screen. So that's really jarring because historically open source models haven't even gotten a fraction of a percent compared to the big closed source model companies as they have now. So there's a lot of progress with open source models versus closed source models. And interestingly enough, given the fact that GPUs have become easier and easier for you to rent, like you can go on Lambda and literally get a GPU for $4.99 per hour, it has become really sustainable for enterprises to self-host open source models, potentially change them around for their specific tasks, and they get better outputs. And it's actually honestly sometimes less cost than the APIs. So that's a big trend that's happening, and people are really deeply evaluating whether they want to stick with using LLM APIs like OpenAI API as opposed to just self-hosting an open source model. Building on the point about adaptation, our second trend to keep in mind is the fact that you can adapt super easily these days. And additionally, the adaptation is super important. It's equally important to the pre and mid training. So, as I said earlier, if you put in a lot of money on the front end of the training, which is basically pre and mid training, which is when you're giving the model a bunch of facts, you actually don't really need to worry too much about the post training. That's not the case anymore. Post training is actually when you teach the model how to take those facts and think about them. So that has become more and more important. And there are a few conventional methods for this, right? There's full fine tuning. There is, and obviously that's a subsection of supervised fine tuning. There is LoRa, which is like a smaller section of full fine tuning. There's reinforcement learning. So I can get into all of this jargon, obviously, but I'm not for today's video at least. So essentially, what has happened is there have been new developments in post training that have made it really, really effective. For instance, in many cases, reinforcement learning has been used in conjunction with full fine tuning. There's a lab called Thinking Machines. It's started by Mira Murati, who is ex C-suite at OpenAI before she left to start her new lab. And what they've done is they've created something called on-policy distillation. What that means is you can effectively teach the model in the game. So let's say the model is an athlete. The model is essentially playing let's say, a game, right? And usually what you would do is you would give the coaching before the game and say, hey, when you're going out to play the game, just remember my coaching. This is not often ineffective because sometimes the model forgets what it's coaching. Maybe it's panicked or whatever. Obviously, that doesn't actually happen. But what on policy distillation does is while you're actually playing the game, your coach is yelling to you, "Hey, practice your forehand." Right. So this is obviously an extrapolated analogy, but it while you're generating, it actually gives suggestions and it iteratively improves. So there are a lot of really good adaptation techniques that are making adaptation equally important to essentially training beforehand. So that's the second trend that's really, really important to watch, and that's very critical for enterprises because many of them are doing adaptations, right? So that's enabling them to really push forward on their intellectual property. So that's the second trend where adaptation is becoming more and more important. And number three, and arguably one of the most interesting trends, is we have moved away from replacing human connection, which I think is great. A lot of the narrative around AI was we're going to try to replace as much human connection as possible, and that's a very bad and unethical idea, in my opinion. Companies like historically tried to replace human connection in ways that is unsustainable and unregulated. However, those companies are slowly dying off, and what is actually being replaced with is companies like this company called Mutual. And essentially, what they're doing is they're using AI to connect humans with other humans. So the next generation of social networks are coming out. OpenAI recently announced their group chats, right? You can have group chats with other people, and that's completely agentic and supported by their models. So everybody is getting into this game of social connection, and not to replace social connection like what was happening beforehand. Now it's focused on how do we enable humans to meet other humans, interact with other humans in effective ways using AI, which is a much more ethical use case than hey, let's replace this person's social connection. So historically, the people who have been super effective at social networks is Meta, right? Obviously, Facebook was ahead of its time, and now they have gone pretty silent on the AI for connecting people angle. Again, Mark Zuckerberg's famously said that he's in the business of human connection. So it remains unclear to see what actions Meta is taking on using AI to connect people more effectively and building on their existing social empire. So that's something that we haven't really seen from Meta recently. So I would be very interested to see what developments Meta has planned on that because companies like OpenAI, companies like Series is a really really phenomenal startup for my viewers. If you're interested in seeing what that does, please take a look because I think it's really really interesting. Basically, what you're doing is you're effectively enabling social connection using AI. So that's another trend that is emerging and many companies are tackling. So it's very interesting to see where that goes. So, in summary, we have three critical trends kind of going into the end of this year on AI. Number one, open source models are getting closer to closed source models, and I gave the example of Kimi K2 Thinking. Number two, adaptation is becoming equally important to pre and mid training. And I gave a specific example of on policy distillation. And in the description of this video, I'm going to provide a lot of resources and research papers that go a little bit more in depth into the technical aspect of things as to what these new developments kind of are. So if you're interested, please take a look in the description. There are a bunch of research papers on archive that you can take a look at. And three, basically, social connection being enabled by AI instead of being replaced by AI is becoming an industry standard, which is really, really great from both an ethical and a profitability perspective, because I believe that actually social networks are going to make a lot more money being able to actually connect people, so it works out for both parties. So these are three trends to watch in AI. Obviously, this is a blitz speed overview of what actually is going on in the industry, because the AI industry is not only modular, meaning it's constantly changing, it's also immense. So if you're interested in seeing more videos like this or specific deep dives into each of these individual concepts, please like, subscribe, leave comments. It really, really helps me out and enables me to continue to make more videos like this. Or reach out to me. I'm always open. You can email me at neuralbridgepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the video.